Okay, thank you very much. Hello, and thank you everyone for joining. At Galarath, we are excited to announce the new SEER for Software Agile Planner. And today I'd like to speak to how the Agile Planner can help ensure capital budgets fit into the delivery promises. Now, just under a decade ago, it became obvious that software was driving most all innovation. And the Wall Street Journal tried to answer the question, why is software eating the world? Companies like Hewlett-Packard, they were moving their investment away from hardware and into software. At the same time that software was growing, the Agile community grew larger and larger, became more influential. And Forbes then tried to answer the question, why Agile is eating the world? Because the benefits of Agile were becoming self-evident, especially for companies that worried about time to market and software quality. So in reality, what we're finding is that Agile adoption transformation has really impacted every industry. We can now find the Agile influencing the different technologies, the different business sectors, and the Agile adoption is literally transforming how software is being delivered. Now, not all these stories are success stories, but the wrinkles of Agile methods are being worked out enough so that in the US government, a few years ago, DeWitt found that 80% of all major federal IT projects today were considered Agile, or at a minimum, they're iterative. And in the banking world, the Agile is being seen as a way of increasing productivity and project effectiveness. Over the healthcare world, they're looking for Agile as a way to adopt new ways of looking at software development and service to the industry. But what was really enlightening is that the PMI did a study just last year, and they found that 71% of all organizations of all types, they reported using Agile approaches sometimes, often, or always. So Agile is not only transforming software development, it's also impacting cost estimation. And this is especially true in how software is being funded. Now, due to a discovery nature of Agile, that relationship finance and development is changing. So the CFO-CIO collaboration is now becoming critical. But before we deep dive into how this is evolving, let's have a little reminder of how we currently fund software. Now, most everyone is familiar with this process. You know, on the left, we start with some type of idea stage, some new business opportunity. That gets handed off to the development folks, a CIO, maybe a contractor, to develop some type of high-level estimate. They come up with a ROM estimate to get that big bucket of money to start the work. Then that gets presented either to the CFO side of an organization or perhaps even to Congress. And they try to identify where that budget fits in the capital funding that's available. And quite often that ROM estimate gets revised downward. Then when it comes time to do the work, that low bidder or whoever starts the work, they have to kind of revise that estimate to fit that available budget. But unfortunately, sometimes they don't even eliminate all the costly features. They're trying to satisfy the customer with the money that's available. And we all know what happens is we start having those cost overruns, and we get into that mode where the auditors and GAO are doing autopsies on the work. And sadly, it is tragic enough that it has become comical. Even in Dilbert, you know, we see the question, how much will it cost to develop our next generation product? And Dilbert says, it will cost whatever you put in the budget. Now, what's interesting is that we are actually seeing new trends in funding processes directly related to Agile methods. Now, Agile literally is influencing these CFO-CIO relationships I was describing. Now, the statistic out of CIO magazine is kind of eye-opening. It says only 31% of CIOs collaborate regularly with the CFO in small organizations and 19% at larger organizations. So in the past, there hasn't been much collaboration, but Agile is now changing that. And what we at Gallup are observing that there's this fundamental shift in these large organizations. We've been working with a large insurance provider that actually moved its entire 14,000 person development staff to Agile. And that means they also had to change how they budget their projects. So what Agile is doing on the finance side is they're actually forcing the use of operational expense budgets to allow for some type of preliminary cost analysis. And over on the development side, the CIOs are actually trying to provide some type of informed budget requests early in the life cycle because they want to give something that's a predictable and proven product. So for the cost folks, what Agile is doing is, you know, for them, they're just interested, can Agile show us that this investment's really going to pay off before we commit the money? And the CIOs are actually trying to just demonstrate that the product can actually achieve business goals. So what I did is I found a sample use case from industry, and this example is from Harvard Business Review, and it's from a few years ago. And what we're going to see is that the old practice of developing extensive business cases has shifted to high-level budget forecasts, and that gets followed with some short proof of concept. So in this example, the person that wrote the article said that when the decisions you're making is strategic, you need to budget using a top-down approach. It says get only as granular as you need in order to have enough information to make your decision. And in this case study, what they did was they said, let's go ahead and see, use as an example building an online bookstore. And we are all familiar with those, maybe Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Here's the screenshot from Libris, which I like to use. And the high-level question you're asking is, what high-level functionality can we maybe get our arms around? In this case, they said, well, we need a shopping cart, browse books, search books, etc. But the takeaway line is really the question, do we have enough information to answer how much is it going to cost? And the answer is probably not. So in industry, what they're doing now is they're actually going out and engaging the CIO, the development team, to get a ROM level estimate that actually is so much decomposed to help them make these decisions. So in this example, they went through each of the items. The development team described how many weeks it would take and how much money they thought it might take. And what you end up seeing, though, is that for this shopping cart delivery, we're looking anywhere from 8 to 45 months. And the cost is anywhere from $750,000 to $4.3 million. And there's the problem, right? This range is too wide to make a very informed decision. So this budget planning needs really a parametric model that understands agile methods. And that's where the SEER Software Agile Planner comes in. So the goal of the Agile Planner is to help bridge that technical solution with the financial and resource requirements so that in the end, you're going to get a credible total ownership cost. And within the Agile Planner, it supports high-level budget forecast. It'll also support bottoms-up estimation. And in the end, you're going to get that quantifiable total cost estimate. Now, when you're doing that high-level budget forecast, the planner allows you to enter the information from just high-level ROM or high-level business requirements, or even maybe some historical data if you have it. As we saw in the spreadsheet there, it'll also even allow you to bring in an estimate expressed as FTEs over time. Ultimately, what's going to happen, though, is you're going to get a preliminary risk-based estimate that's generated, and then you can go forward and do your user story construction or whatever it is you want to do going forward. On the other side of the coin, though, maybe you already have your user stories and you want to go ahead and build a bottoms-up estimate. And so the Agile Planner can accept the bottom-up estimate, and it can express it any size metric you want. Maybe you're using story points, lines of code, or function points, affinity points, rice objects. There's so many different things out there. And this estimate then can also be partitioned upon your different releases or by teams or both. And what's really cool is the Agile Planner is going to calculate a preliminary velocity for that very first sprint. And lastly, what's going to happen is you are going to get a total ownership cost. And the Agile Planner, from that high-level budget backlog estimate, it can create a sprint planning model. And that sprint planning model could also include things like an initial sprint 0 or a back-end user acceptance testing. Typically, these things aren't accounted for in the initial planning. So Agile Planner is actually delivering on both of these needs, the high-level and the bottoms-up. So kind of the question, how does it work? Well, the Agile Planner provides the power of the parametric model at whatever scale you're going to need, high-level budgets or that detailed sprint planning like I talked about. It all starts the same way. You simply identify the problem you're working with. So are you determine if you're working with a high-level budget or if you want to do a bottoms-up estimate. And the next step is to simply go through and select the appropriate knowledge bases for the Agile project. Those folks that here today, that if you're familiar with the SEER suite of tools, you know that many of them are knowledge-based driven, and this helps us pre-populate the parametric values. And once you've selected those knowledge bases, it's easy enough to save that off, so this estimate is reusable and easy to use the next time. And step 3 here then is once you get the knowledge bases set, you're going to go through and just literally kind of describe the work that's being done. You can take a high-level single point estimate, or if you want, you can decompose that backlog into smaller partitions. And those smaller parts could be by teams or even by deliverables. And then each of those individual parts can be further granulated or identified by different team sizes. Maybe they have different sprint durations, even different sizing metrics. One of the function points, lines of code, another one in story points. So once you've got it identified what you're going to do, you simply just generate the estimate. And so the planner is going to create this backlog estimate or a detailed sprint plan depending on which way and what you identified when you identified the problem. And generally what folks will do is they'll flush out the backlog before they generate that detailed sprint plan. So that use case we saw earlier, that's kind of a good example for us to use in, going forward. All right, so in that case study, there is the requirement was for some type of quick high-level estimate, and so the CFO wanted a budget for all the work to be performed and was more than happy if you just gave them a range estimate. And so the development team, they came back with a ROM estimate for an Agile team, 4 people, so it's a team of 4 working 2-week sprints, and the cost was around $25,000 per month. And ultimately what happened was you ended up getting a backlog budget where all that functionality was included, and there was the ranges there for the weeks and the work to be done. And then of course the blended rate was used to calculate the cost estimate. So what we could do though is we could actually take this and put this into the Agile Planner for a real quick and simple solution that fits what they're looking for. So what we're going to do then is we want to see how this budget is estimated using SEER for software. I'm going to launch a video from the Agile Planner sessions found on SEER University. Let's take a look at our case study from the Agile Planner. We've built the entire backlog for all the features, and we're assuming 2-week sprint durations. Within the Agile Planner, we can see this is going to be about a 19-month effort. The cost will be around $1.9 million, but more importantly, we calculated a velocity of 51 function points with a team size of 4. If we look at the Monte Carlo report, we can understand where we are in the larger picture. At 50% confidence, we have about $1.8 million in 18 months, but our min and our maximum schedules are actually not within the boundary ranges of the original budget. Of course, this is going to be for a single team of 4 people doing all the work on something ranging from 800 to 3900 function points in size. Okay, so without a doubt, that video actually begs some questions, right? How was the velocity calculated? How did we get those effort weeks to become function points? And that estimate was just one 4-person team doing all the work. What if you used multiple Scrum teams? How would that impact the estimate? And probably even more so, how does the actual Agile Planner really work? These are all really good questions, but what I want to do is I want to go back to the case study for just a moment to decompose this to help us moving forward as we go into the Agile Planner. You can see where these results came from. Okay, so we had our initial budget estimate from that industry use case, and we built our estimate based upon that, and so we got our cost risk curve available to us. And so we can map that original budget to our cost risk curve, and what we'll see is that the maximum budget is actually at an 80% probability range. So if our most likely cost, or most likely outcome would be 50%, that max budget is way overstating the problem. And likewise at the other end, the $775,000 actually kind of falls off the table there. It's actually less than 1% chance of getting this work done for that cost. Then if we go ahead and take a look at the midpoint, somewhere in the middle of that estimate is around 1.75 million, we can look at our S-curve and we'll find that that's really only about 40% probable. So regardless of where you are in this decision-making process as a CFO or the CIO, you now have a lot more information to create an informed business decision on how you want to go forward. Okay, so we can look at all those lingering questions a bit more with an understanding that solution provided by the Agile Planner. So Agile was invented to make solving hard questions easier, and the Agile Planner is intended to do the same thing for budgeting and building up understanding of what costs are going to be. So to those questions, how did that Agile Planner understand the velocity? Well, as I mentioned, we're using knowledge bases, and when you pair knowledge base with size volumes, you get an understanding of the overall complexity of the problem. And the Agile Planner then uses that understanding along with the identified team sizes and sprint durations, and it can calculate that initial sprint velocity. This is something you don't see anywhere else in the industry, is an initial sprint velocity being provided for you. And the next question is, how did the effort in weeks become function points? That's a pretty straightforward answer, because once we had a given velocity in function points and we knew the sprint duration, it became simple math. And by the way, as I mentioned before, we could have done this using any size measure like story points. And then there was a question about what if multiple Scrum teams did the work? And that's really a really good question, because we might expect more efficiency if we had additional teams involved. However, there's a trade-off. More teams may reduce the schedule, but it's likely going to increase the cost. So let's take a look at how the velocity and function point range was estimated using the Agile Planner, and we're going to watch this video from SEER University. We can launch the Agile Planner by selecting the Agile Planner button on the ribbon bar. This will launch the Agile Planner dialog box. Since we're building a backlog item, we can select the backlog button to create our initial plan, or we can load a plan if we have one available. The plan contains all of our knowledge bases and any other settings. When we click Next, we can see that our knowledge bases are already pre-populated, or we could have made changes. All we have to do now is say, how much work can a Scrum team do, so we can understand how much velocity should we expect going forward. So we'll just simply do a little silly name here. How much can the Scrum team do? And we'll add the team size, select that 4, which matches our case study, and 2 weeks for our sprint duration. And I'm going to choose unadjusted function points as my size measure. I'll enter 100 function points for my least likely and most. This is just an arbitrary number, so that when I hit the update key, it'll give me a calculated velocity. So I can see that I have a velocity of 51 function points per sprint, and then 2 sprints I could actually do this 100 function points. If I increase this number, let's say to 1,000, and rerun the update, notice that the function point velocity doesn't change. This is in keeping with constant velocity of a Scrum sprint. Now in this case study, the duration that was forecast was 16 to 28 sprints. At 51 function points per sprint, that gives us a range of around 800 to 39 function points. I rounded down just for easy math. So now all we have to do is go in and set our least value to 800. We can set our most value to 3,900, and we can decide on a midpoint. I'll go ahead and just select 2,000 as the middle point. And just to clean this up, I'm just going to go up and get rid of this silly name, and we'll go ahead and give it something meaningful like all features, because that's what will show up in the WBS structure. Click OK, and I'll select Plan button to build the plan. We're asked if we want to save our plan. I've already have it saved, and there we go. Simple as that. Okay, so for this video shows how to solve a simple high-level budget, but the reality is the Agile Planner supports really complex backlogs if you want to do that as well. So you can take any backlog and decompose it by features, epics, however it is that you're creating your scales, or you might want to create your backlog on a certain item and decompose it by team or vendors. The nice part though is however you partition it, each backlog item can have a unique team size, different sprint durations, different sizing metrics, even different language used. But as I said before, what's really cool though is each backlog item is going to have some type of unique velocity. So whatever the problem is you're working on, if it's a huge ERP transformation of a payroll system, or maybe it's a insurance company is trying to look at a time to market for some type of product offering, the Agile Planner is going to help you understand what those total ownership cost. But as equally important as to understanding that, it also is providing the transparency, right? So because the decision planning is about making trade-offs, and that Agile Planner is providing you with that visibility, that information that the decision makers need to have. Now in this example on the left side, we see the 2 different types of approaches for building the estimate. There was the total backlog, that was the first one I did, and then we also decomposed it by features. So after I decomposed it by features on the right, I can compare the 2 approaches back and forth. So this kind of goes to answering the question, what if we had multiple teams? And what we see is that if you break this into smaller pieces with multiple teams, you can actually reduce that schedule by 40% by only adding about 6% more of the cost. Now this is information normally a chief financial officer would never get, and a good chance the CIO didn't even know this. But something else is really important here. If you look at it, the smaller teams are actually showing an 11% improvement in quality. This is all really, really good information to have. And the reality though is Agile methods, they've kind of forced the software industry to engage in these constant trade-off analysis like this. And that's where the Agile Planner is kind of reshaping how to do this trade-off analysis. Come another nice little quote from the CIO website. It says that when Agile is new in an organization or still not well established, finding the right way to get budget for your initiative can be quite tricky. And that's where the Agile Planner is really coming into play here. Because see over on that left side, the financial officer, they're literally moving away from these business cases, the old-fashioned style business case, tell me how much, what you're really going to give me in exchange for the money. And they're expending their operational expense funds to for some little short proof of concept kickstarts. And on the CIO side, they're actually using these little kickstart initiatives within little small time boxes, so they can first of all minimize the cost and risk going forward, but also to give the team some type of calibration phase and really understand if that work is going to be doable. So they're getting their arms around the risk early. So the chief financial officer, what they're interested in is, what is the potential success for this thing that we're going to be building before I commit any capital funds? And the CIO, he's still trying to understand, well, are all my program risks before he goes holding his hands out saying, I need this much money from the capital funds. Okay. And at Galleroth, we're really deeply entrenched in these new trends in budgeting and these different types of cost estimation. And what we are literally seeing is a new trending process for Agile funding. There's an underlying expectation within this community that doing a little some Agile early actually helps with these business decisions. So it kind of starts the same way on the left side. There's some type of idea or business opportunity that wants to be investigated. But this time, instead of throwing it over the wall for a ROM, they're actually throwing over to the CIO and the development team. They run a few sprints, 2, 3, maybe 4 sprints, and to see if the actual work is even feasible. And they get their funding for that work out of the operational expense budget. And then what happens is there's a little bit of collaboration between the CFO and the CIO. They start negotiating funding if it's worth going forward. And perhaps that's where they come to an agreement along with the ultimate product owner on what the actual final set of capabilities is going to be when it's delivered. Once that negotiation is done, then they have a budget. And that budget is what determines what your initial plan backlog is going to be. And from there, the Agile team picks it up with the product owner, and they go forward building the product, and they either do all the sprints, or perhaps the product owner is happy and they stop the program early when the functionality is there. So the key feature of this evolving process is how Agile is provided for a proof of concept gateway before the capital funds are allocated. And now the tricky part, it can be knowing what to use for that little kickstart to initiate the activity. And again, the Agile Planner is going to help you select those kickstarts. Okay, so one of the problems with just using a simple spreadsheet and this little chart you see here is that there could be some assumptions that are masking the complexity of these small efforts. So you might just want to go grab the smallest thing, browse books, or not. The Agile Planner is going to help you make those decisions. And what you'll do is you partition that high-level budget forecast, and you either use that initial estimate, or you might want to go ahead and start a bottoms-up estimate. Some teams, what they'll do is maybe the larger things like manage inventory, a preview inside the book, maybe they think that's the real technology differentiator between their website and Amazon.com. So what they might want to do is go ahead and break that down into user stories and do a story point count and run 2 or 3 sprints for those things in order to do the proof of concept. So whichever way you're doing it, you're creating some type of trade-off decision. And ultimately what we're seeing in this trending process is that they're taking operational expense money, they're running 3 to 4 sprints or less with some type of reasonable budget requirement. So what is it that's going to be reasonable that can get done in that amount of time? Okay. So right now is where the Agile Planner is kind of helping support that trade-off study. So on the bottom left, we see that initial budget, and across the top, what I've done is I've created I brought in the charts, the S-curve charts, and what we see is the cost across the top, and I converted schedule to sprints, and it's for each of the items. And as we go forward, we can kind of see that the first 3 items are kind of out of the ballpark as far as we're concerned for just sprints and stuff. We're not going to try and decompose this. So the next option might be that small one, the browse books. But when we look at browse books and that initial budget of $25K to $50K, it turns out that that range is really around 5% to less than 50% probability they can get that work done. So that initial estimate isn't really a very good estimate. So they may want to pass on that one as well. If we go look at the next one, we can see that the shopping cart, that range is between 25% to about 70%. But if we look at the most likely outcome, we're looking at $153,000, which is smack in the middle of the original budget cost, and it's a 4-week sprint. And the reality is, when you look at the SEER model, that was really only about 3.2 sprints. So they potentially could even get it done sooner. Okay. So what we're doing is whatever decision is going to be made, at least the decision makers now have some good information for their budget planning. Okay, and so far we've just been focusing on high-level estimates, but the Agile Planner also supports very detailed sprint planning so that we know what all the total ownership costs are going to be. So the Agile Planner actually dives deep. And what we really want as a financial officer is we want to know what all the costs are going to be. Sometimes a development team, they're focused on just the part they have to deliver. Maybe they don't even know what the ongoing support costs are going to be. So within the Agile Planner and the SEER environment, we give you the tools to understand what's going to happen in the sprint planning session. So you can literally take a feature or a backlog item and decompose it. And the model will identify how many sprints you're going to need and decompose it for you. But it will also generate a sprint zero if you want. A lot of times teams will launch a sprint zero. This is when they do their backlog replanning, or they refine their backlog, or they're bringing their team together, or maybe the infrastructure is being set up. And a lot of times these initial sprint zero sessions last longer than what a standard sprint size might be. Another thing that's often overlooked is the final testing. So even though most testing is done during the sprints and throughout the process, there are a lot of agencies and different product owners, they actually require a final user acceptance testing or maybe some type of certification testing happen. The SEER Agile Planner will calculate how much effort you need to spend in those phases. So ultimately what you're getting is a total ownership cost of everything, including ongoing support costs. Once the Agile team is, they've made their delivery, they folded up shop, they're on to the next thing, that software still costs money to sustain. And the SEER for software environment helps you understand what those ongoing costs are. Okay, so you can see the Agile Planner provides valuable decision-making information for the CFO as well as the CIO. Okay, so all the information that you need can be allocated into a single model. In this example, you can see how the initial questions around the budget evolve into a detailed plan. So at the top, that's kind of like where the budget planning stuff goes on, looking at backlogs and looking at the problem in the large. And then for the development staff, they can go in and deep dive and go and generate their sprint planning sessions and get a really full picture of what the total costs are going to be. Now, this is all exciting, but you probably want to know how did that get built. So what we're going to do now is we're going to show you how the Agile Planner actually creates those sprint estimates using the video from SEER University. One of the nice features of the Backlog Planner is the ability to create a detailed sprint plan from one of the backlog items. This time, we'll go to the ribbon bar. From the Agile Planner button, we'll select the Create Agile Plan from this element. And this time when we launch the dialog box for the Agile Planner, instead of asking for the background estimate to be built, we'll just select the sprint. We can also choose to select a sprint zero. This gives us that time up in the front of the estimate to put our team together, set our infrastructure in place. We can also say that we want to include integration and testing at the back end. This might be a final user acceptance testing. And should we be closing the final sprint early, we could say close it early or go ahead and complete the entire duration of the sprint, maybe for some refactoring. This time when we're going to create a description that's a little bit more specific for what we're doing, so we're looking at the preview book sprint. We'll select next. And the item that we selected from the backlog initially is what shows up in the dialog box. We'll select edit. And what we want to do now is if we want to change our mind about how many people are on the team or how long the sprints will be, we'll go ahead and set 4 to our team size as in the case study, and we'll keep that same 2-week sprint. But we could have changed this, or we could have even changed the size of this backlog if something had changed in the meantime. We'll click OK, and we'll go ahead and select the Plan button. And this will prompt us to see if we want to save the Agile Plan again. We'll just go ahead and click No. And what will happen in the background, you can see that the plan is being built for us. All the actual individual sprint sessions are being laid out. And there we go. It's in the WBS structure. Go ahead and expand the box a little bit so we can see everything. I'll collapse the initial backlog features so we can see just the sprint planning section. And there we are, sprint 0, our set of sprints, all the way out, all 8 sprints in this case, and our final backlog testing. There you go. Pretty cool. Okay, so like Agile, the Agile Planner can literally kind of help transform every industry with their agile planning and their budgeting. In the U.S. government, all those different agencies that are trying to build their estimates, regardless of the size or the acquisition category, the Agile Planner would work for them. So it's not just a small scale solution. In the financial sector, those folks working with the vetting process, that's a lot of intense governance and market volatility. The parametric model is brilliant for that because it understands about the governance issues that are going on in that industry. Likewise with healthcare, they have these different moving regulatory adoption requirements, and when the regulation comes out, they have to get the changes to the healthcare structure implemented within a 30-day time frame by law. So they can take advantage of the planner to really understand what's happening. But more importantly, those folks at PMI called out, that 71% of the people are doing it, this tool will actually help them bridge that technical solution for the finance teams that are really looking for a credible total ownership cost. Now, in closing, earlier we saw that the Wall Street Journal proclaimed that software was eating the world, and last year Forbes announced that the Agile was eating the world. Well, today we're happy to hear of another event that's taking place. Why the Agile Planner is going to be eating the world. Thank you all for participating today, and we'll go ahead and open it up for questions.
Thank you, David. If you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A panel or the chat, and we will start with the questions. Okay, Dave, I have first one for you. In an earlier slide, it was mentioned that you can use story points instead of function points. We use story points. How does that work?
Well, as you probably know, story points are an arbitrary metric and it's team dependent. So in other words, story points, they don't scale well across multiple teams. In the previous release of Surface Software, we introduced a plugin called a size metric generator. And this feature allows you to create a sizing unit however you might describe the work. For example, t-shirt sizing or something new I heard about in Agile called rocks and pebbles, whatever that might be. But the size metric generator is going to allow you to establish how much effort your size volume require, and the user can then use that vocabulary to enter the size for the problem. So in the case of story points, from what we saw earlier in the web-based online library, the sizes were 51 function points per sprint. Well, if your team calls their velocity 80 story points per sprint or 150 story points per sprint, it doesn't really matter. Underneath, it's going to be 51 function points to do that sprint. So the story point input could be used to scale to that function point equivalent. Now, the real benefit of this is it provides an underlying productivity measure that uses an industry standard as opposed to some arbitrary scale decided upon during a poker planning session, right? Not all story points are created equal. Now, story points are welcome. They just simply need to be scaled for the team. Hopefully that answered that question.
Okay, thank you. Which version of SEER for software is this feature included in?
This is the latest release, 8.3.
Okay, thanks.
Hot off the presses.
In the example, you use teams of 4 and 2 week sprints. Does changing that change the velocity?
Yeah, sure. If you're going to make any changes in the Agile Planner, directly impacts the velocity calculation. One thing to remember that it's a great benefit. You're not stuck with some predetermined team size or time box, right? So each backlog item can be scaled uniquely. But the biggest benefit I find as a Scrum Master is that the Agile Planner generates and calculates this probable velocity before your very first sprint. That's unheard of. In the past, what we had to do, we always had to guess what that velocity was going to be. So hopefully that answered that question.
Okay. Does SEER actually say that the team can do 51 FPs in 2 weeks with 4 FTEs, or is that just made up?
No, that was an actual calculation right from the tool. So yeah, in the demo, what you saw was the tool actually doing the math under the hood to come up with that velocity calculation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question. I noticed that the Agile Planner had some other options for staffing. Can you explain what those are for? I saw something that said optimal staff.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, this webinar wasn't intended to do a deep dive into Agile Planner functionality, but that question is actually kind of worth a quick demo. Let me pop up the tool. And Kelly, can you see the SEER environment now?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so just kind of give you an example of how that works. We can go to this initial backlog that we started. This was that high-level backlog, this single item. And I'm going to go into the Agile Planner. Let's just recreate this Agile plan for the same thing. So we were working on a backlog. Click Next. Here's where we saw all the knowledge bases. I click Next. And let's go in and actually see what happens with the different team sizes and stuff. So when we built this, we said we had 4 team members, and it was 2 weeks. We hit the update, and see that right there is where that was actually calculated to 51 function points. But notice that this is in red. And what that is telling me is that this isn't really an optimal team size. If I move the slider, I can get a little bit closer to what might be optimal and what might be too large to use. So in this example, something of this size, it really isn't optimal to use just one team. One of the things I can do, I can actually come over here and click the Use SEER Optimal Team Size, run my update, and it comes back and it's telling me the optimal team size would be used somewhere around 9.74 total people. So that may be 2 teams of 5 or whatever, or however you might predetermine it. And you can actually reduce your sprints, and by adjusting the team to this size, it's also adjusting the velocity of work that can be done, right? So that's kind of how it works, and that's one of the real nice features of it is if I don't know how big of a team I need, the tool's going to come back and tell me based upon the complexity, the size, and those K-based settings, which actually are what's driving that complexity understanding, as well as the total size of the software. And again, while I'm in here, I always have the option to change this functionality as well. Maybe I want to just decompose this to break it into small teams. Okay, hopefully that answered that question.
All right, thank you. How would you integrate Agile Planner in aerospace where the upfront estimate is used for contract and the team still uses Agile for development?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, we have a brand new knowledge base. Let me pop this open really fast. It's called Hybrid Agile. And a hybrid agile kind of is what you're addressing, where there's upfront a lot of initial work being done for the kind of what we call that waterfall cycle up front. The Scrum is kind of that internal stuff that we're doing in the middle to build the software out. So we're running sprints in the middle, but you still got this IoT testing that has to be done in the back end. So this knowledge base is actually addressing that problem. And so when it's calculating the schedule size and the effort, that's all coming into consideration right there. So it's kind of a real simple, just knowledge-based setting is all you would need to do. Another option then would be is if you already have the requirements work done, you could go ahead and just isolate that, turn off the requirements work, and start with whatever your backlog planning session is going to look like. Yeah. Hopefully that answered that one.
Excellent. Can you feed this info into other tools like TFS or ServiceNow?
The SEER for Software environment has an open API, and so what a lot of organizations do is they take the information, you have access to every input and every output that the model generates or uses, and you could take that and export that externally. And as I said, it's a, I forgot the term for it, O&E, or I forgot the term, but anyway, it's a Microsoft compliant to other tools, and what most organizations do is they will just export this, get the data, and then ingest that into another stream. Some organizations even that are like using Clarity and some of those items, the tool also has the ability to export the information into Microsoft Project, and they're importing Microsoft Project. So there's a lot of different options. We also already currently support Oracle Primavera P6 as an integration tool.
Very good. Can you please describe the data sets used to build the Agile knowledge base?
Yeah, so as a research company as well as a tool developer and a services organization, we do lots of research, and so we collect data from all over the world. We have data donated to us, we buy data, we just collect it from all over the place. And so what we're doing most recently, we've really been focusing on capturing Agile projects from all over. So as you can imagine, some of the Agile projects, we really have to scale depending upon what we understand is happening in those environments. So I think for the most part, I'd have to defer to the development team how they're doing this, or the research folks, is I think what they're doing is for the Agile projects, we're actually acquiring them from an organization that's grabbing them and making sure that the data has been sanitized and it's consistent data. I don't know the total number of projects we have. It's fairly large. And the Agile Planner capability that you're seeing here was all piloted using Excel initially. And so we've been building a lot of Agile estimates from the Excel spreadsheet to flush out this proof of concept, and it's been working in those environments already.
Thank you. If you know your team's velocity, can you override the calculations? And if you perform an actual function point count on the backlog, do you still use ranges in the planner?
Two good questions. Okay, so the first one, if you know the velocity, that's really good if you know the velocity. So what you would do is you would build the model. The model is going to tell you what it thinks the velocity is, and then what you're going to do is you're going to make adjustments to the individual parameters that are going to move the capabilities or the effort up or down to match what you're doing as the velocity. So what you're kind of doing is you're kind of coming in the back door with matching your velocity by understanding what parameters are influencing the reason why your velocity is so much faster or why your velocity is slower. I forgot what the second question was. What was the second part?
Sure. If you perform an actual function point count on the backlog, do you still use ranges in the planner?
Well, yeah, there's two things you can do. Normally when you do a function point count, it's always that plus or minus 10%. So you can inject that plus or minus 10%. Or what you can do is just use that as a single value. And then within SEER for software, we also give you the ability, let me bring it up really fast. You can specify the phased estimate where you are. So this is another way. So this has a fixed function point count of 51, but I can come in and actually say I'm at a different phase of my life cycle. The reason why you might want to do this is if you understand a cone of uncertainty, this is overlaying the cone of uncertainty on that number 51 that we had. So how good was that number? And you can kind of express that by where you are in the development life cycle, but you don't have to. If you trust that number, you can just leave that number where it is.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a few more questions. We have time for them, so let's do it. The next question is, what does the backlog look like and how does it get built when it has to be uploaded into the Agile Planner?
Oh, well, in that one video, I think, Kelly, you're going to make a link back to this webinar and to the
yes.
Information. What you'll see is that I actually built it in the backlog planner, and I brought it up and I said, this is how many function points it's going to be. So there wasn't really a loading in there. If you do have something already set, like say you already have a known backlog of multiple items and you maybe have an Excel spreadsheet, that API capability I was talking about earlier, which is what we call server mode, you can actually automate that spreadsheet and have it build the backlog for you, bring that information in. But what you're still going to need to do is run the planner on that information so that you can do the correct Agile schedule adjustments to the model.
Okay. What measures for actual calibrations are available?
Say that one more time.
What measures for actual calibration are available?
What measure? Oh, well, within the calibration mode, you have the ability to go in and identify the actual effort and schedule for all phases of that life cycle. So you can, if you happen to know all that, you can put that in there. Maybe all you really know is how you're doing on a per sprint basis. You could drop that in for each of your sprints, what your actual effort was and schedule, and that allows you to start doing calibration. And then there's also another feature in the tool called Project Monitor Control. So if you really want to get granular, you want to be managing your sprint projects, your Agile projects, you can go in and actually start monitoring each of the releases or sprints as they go forward and tracking that information to find out where you are going with in the life cycle of your project. Generally, we kind of shy away from that because there are just so many tools out there like Jira and RallySoft and the other packages that are doing a good job of doing that really low-level sprint management work. However, if you want to, you could do that in the Project Monitor Control feature of SEER.
In the example you used, the whole backlog or one of the main features, how do you handle a backlog in which a minimum viable product is defined?
Well, a minimum viable product is being defined. What I would do is by saying minimum viable product, you're already expressing uncertainty. So you would probably have to scale that solution to understand how much uncertainty is in there. Or if what you're talking about is you're trying to scale the problem down to where you just say, this is the least amount of work I want to be able to do. Again, if you're already decomposing, if you're doing something like that, you probably already have user stories and you've got your tasks identified, you simply drop that into the model. The tool will accept story points. If you're breaking down by ideal days or task hours, the tool will accept that as well. So it'll handle just about anything you want to throw at it.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, a couple more questions. How do you get the function point size for your features without measuring them? And how do you know you can do 51 FP per sprint and not 30 or 60?
Good question. Okay, well, the first part there is in my industry case study, someone went out and did an expert judgment on their thing. So you got some type of subject matter expert that said, this is what we think it should take to get done. Ultimately, that's always kind of the starting point for these types of things. Someone has to say, we think it's going to be about this big. Now, where do they come up with that number? It could just be because they've done this before. Maybe they're using historical data. We should be so lucky. That would be the most ideal way. Generally speaking, they're using analogies or something they've done before. So there was some type of way of formulating that from the previously. With that information, as we demonstrated in the first part of the webinar, it's easy enough to go back and generate a function point size from that. Now, the next question was, can you really get that work done? This is a parametric model, right? So what the model is saying, the most likely outcome would be that you could get 51 function points done. But if we want to, we could go in and look at the range, the probability curves and see how much work can we really get done. And what is the chance, what's the probability this is really going to end up being 80 function points worth of work, or 10 function points worth of work. And of course, that expressing that in terms of effort or cost or schedule. So there is no guarantee that's the number. That is just the 50% most likely outcome. If you're thinking of a bell curve, that's your peak right there. Okay. Or over an S curve, that's where you are in that S curve. It could take longer, it could take less. The nice thing is you have a starting point, right? In the past, we had no clue. We would just say our velocity is 60 story points because we as a team thought that's what we could get done. Now you actually have a math model telling you there's no empirical evidence that you can do any more than this, and there's no empirical evidence that it should take you any less than this in that amount of time. You just got to determine what risk you want to go with from the risk curve.
Okay, I have one more question we can wrap it up with.
Okay.
Given the varying types of Agile flavors across organizations and even within them, does the tool account for varying purities of delivery?
Yeah, so if you're talking about things like Scrumban, which is becoming one of my favorite methodologies, or Kanban, or extreme programming, some of those, what you do for those is you just construct your WBS structure to accommodate that methodology, that delivery method. So for Kanban, it would be more of a manufacturing line process. So I would build my model differently for that methodology. Out of the box, this is designed for Scrum, because 99% of the people that are doing Agile say they're Agile, but what they really mean is they're Scrum, right? They're following a Scrum methodology. So the Agile Planner is kind of targeted for that community. However, a lot of the features within the Agile Planner can be used for those other methodologies as well. And as I said, Kanban is one of my favorite methodologies, and you can simply build that model just by structuring your WBS differently.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dave, for the presentation today, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you do have further questions on the Agile Planner, you can email us at info@galaraf.com. And also, if you have a moment, visit our new website. It's at www.galaraf.com. And we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.